Welcome back, Nazreen. We have with us Professor Kishore Mehbubani. He's been a diplomat with the Singapore government for the last 33 years, and during that time he was a permanent representative twice at the United Nations. He's held a senior most position at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. He's also had an academic career, an illustrious one. He was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Professor Mehbubani has been a prolific author. He has written 9 books. The latest book was Living the Asian Century, a book which is getting great reviews. His earlier books, mostly to do with Asia, China and geopolitics, have been very popular. As we talk about the Asian century, about what is happening in Asia, it was only befitting to bring in a person of his experience and his caliber. Warm welcome to you, Professor. We are honored to have you on our show, and we are most excited that your book Living the Century has just recently been published, and we will be able to talk about that and about what is actually happening in this century and the role that Asia is playing. Warm welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's start with some of the principles that you lay down in your book. For example, you wrote, the great powers will always promote their interests ahead of principles. You wrote in your book, for example, that the world has shown little wisdom in managing conflicts as we speak, and so on and so forth. Can you just reflect a bit on where we are on, for example, Gaza, the way it has been handled, a genocide as we speak continues, and you have the United Nations on the one hand, you have other regional organizations, and seems like nobody is able to do anything about it.
Well, I think, thank you very much for having me on your show. And thank you very much for reading my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, which have just been published, in which I try to distill. I've been studying geopolitics for actually 53 years now. And I try to distill the lessons of geopolitics in that book. And you're absolutely right when you say that there's no such thing as a benevolent great power. In fact, the term benevolent great power is an oxymoron, because all great powers will put their interests ahead of anybody else's interests. And that's a fundamental reality of geopolitics. Has been around for 2,000 or 3,000 years, and it's something that we have to live with. And of course, like you, I'm shocked by the situation in Gaza. And what it has done, clearly, I mean, of course, we should first of all sympathize with the people of Gaza who are suffering enormously what's happening. But at the same time, I think what the rest of the world is also witnessing is the inability of the West to implement the principles of human rights that they have been stoutly speaking about for decades and decades. And yet, when the moment of truth comes, you can see the silence of the West on Gaza. And clearly, this is going to damage the standing of the West globally without a doubt. And this is where the West needs to reflect on itself. Why is it that when the institutions that they created, the International Court of Justice was created not by the Global South, but by the West at the end of World War II. The International Criminal Court was also very much an initiative of Europe. And so the question is, why isn't the West listening to institutions that it created by itself, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, when they are speaking out? And this is what I think is going to damage the standing of the West enormously.
Professor, you wrote in your book, strengths of Western, and I quote, strengths of Western philosophy is that laws of logic are ironclad, that there are no exceptions, and that basically universality, you spoke about that it's a wonderful and powerful weapon during debates, etc. Now, when we come back again to Gaza, I keep raising that because earlier on you mentioned that great powers will always promote their interests, as I guess you would agree that smaller powers also try to do that. But when we see what is happening in Gaza on the one hand, and you know, in other parts of the world where people's rights are denied, don't we see that in a sense the chaos and the violence that is generated, created and spread, that undermines every power's interest because it triggers global instability?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because, you know, we are now, humanity, at a very unusual point in human history. Because on the one hand, clearly humanity has now developed the science and technology, and frankly, we have the resources now to clothe and feed and educate every human being on planet Earth. We have the resources for that. We can do it. But of course, to do that, all of humanity has to cooperate and collaborate, and we must override all the geopolitical divisions that we have. But tragically, at a time when we have a tremendous opportunity to improve the condition of humanity and bring humanity together, unfortunately, we are also seeing the emergence of the largest geopolitical contests ever seen in human history. And of course, the largest geopolitical contest is between the world's number one power, which today is the United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China. And as you know, I've written an entire book, Has China Won?, which tries to explain why this geopolitical contest is gaining momentum at this time, and frankly, why it would be wiser for the world to persuade the US and China to set aside their geopolitical differences and instead focus on the common challenges and opportunities that humanity faces today.
Well, given your kind of vast experience, you're a professor, you've been an ace diplomat, you've actually served in countries, you know, in the middle of strife like Cambodia, and then you've actually in some ways played a very important role in the relationship between Malaysia and Singapore at a very difficult time. When, you know, given your own experience, while you talk about, you know, what is possible given resources, talent, etc., across human civilization, we also see that the emergence of social media, artificial intelligence, etc., it seems to be, and I'm not against technology, but I'm seeing around us that it seems to create more divisions than greater understanding. The angry people, wherever they may be in the world, they get a platform. I don't see an emerging kind of consciousness spreading, a consciousness of peace, of coexistence, of resolving problems as well.
Well, you're right. I mean, sadly, in many places you do see conflicts, and certainly the Gaza war is very distressing. The Ukraine war is very distressing. But at the same time, I think we should also acknowledge that there are some parts of the world where things have improved dramatically and where things continue to improve. And here I must say, since I live in Singapore, we are very fortunate in Singapore that we are in the middle of the ASEAN region.
Yeah.
Because the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, have actually performed several miracles, as I document in my book, the ASEAN miracle. You know, and let me just mention two of them. On the you mentioned about how difficult it is to find peace. Actually, in Southeast Asia, we have had no major wars in our region for 40, 50 years now. And in fact, things have improved a lot in terms of relations among the countries in the region that used to be called the Balkans of Asia. And indeed, there's greater diversity in Southeast Asia than there is in any other part of planet Earth. And despite this diversity, we have kept the peace. Equally importantly, we have provided prosperity to our people because, let me just give you two statistics which are quite stunning. In the year 2000, Japan was the second largest economy in the world in the year 2000. Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN's economy. But today, Japan's economy is only 1.2, 1.3 times bigger than ASEAN. And by 2030, ASEAN will be bigger than Japan.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And then what's even more amazing is that even though the European Union, which, as you know, has got a much bigger economy than the ASEAN economy, about $17-18 trillion. ASEAN is only $3.5 trillion. So the European economy is 5 or 6 times bigger than the ASEAN economy. But in the decade 2010 to 2020, ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the European Union did, which is amazing. So there are some parts of the world where things are going well, and that fortunately, what humanity can do is say, why don't we look at the parts of the world that are doing well and try to understand what is happening there. And certainly one of the reasons why ASEAN is successful is that instead of wars, we engage in consultation and consensus. There are 2 Indonesian words, musyawara and mufakat, consultation and consensus, which explain why ASEAN is at peace and why ASEAN is continuing to grow economically.
Welcome back, Nazir. We have with us Professor Kishore Mehbubani, who is the founding dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Well, you picked up something which is very close to my heart. I was teaching a course on ASEAN last semester in one of Pakistan's leading universities. And I think that indeed the ASEAN, just in terms of presenting to the world a model of coexistence, I mean, South China Sea, the conflicts around it, the number of countries involved in that, for them to actually, instead of going into a conflict mode, go into a negotiation, as you very rightly put, negotiation, coexistence mode. And it seems to be in direct contrast with what we are seeing elsewhere, whether it's South Asia, where the unresolved Kashmir issue continues to basically hound the region, and SAARC, for all practical purposes, is literally a dead organization, and by contrast ASEAN is tremendous. So the ASEAN way, absolutely the miracle of our times. Any chances of it? It doesn't seem like other regions are learning from it, Professor Kishore.
Yeah, I mean that's true, and in fact it's surprising that for example, take Latin America as an example. The per capita income of Latin American countries is still higher than that of ASEAN countries. I think, if I'm not mistaken, their per capita income is double that of the ASEAN countries, and yet despite that, it's been very, very difficult, even for the Latin American countries, to engage in regional cooperation. And recently there was a Mercosur meeting held, and the president of Argentina refused to attend the Mercosur meeting. Yeah. And by contrast, in ASEAN, the leaders show respect for each other, and they would come to ASEAN meetings and find ways and means to bridge whatever the differences that they have there. But the good news is that ASEAN provides a platform not just for the regional powers to come together. Recently when the ASEAN countries had a meeting in Laos, the Secretary of State of the US came, the Foreign Minister of China came, the Foreign Minister of Russia came, the Foreign Minister of Japan, India, South Korea, New Zealand, they all came. So it really shows that ASEAN has got tremendous convening power to bring together not just the countries in the region, but also the countries of around the world, the great powers, to come together too.
So, would you explain how we have a situation where China is in a conflict? I mean, China has conflicts and territorial conflicts with several members of ASEAN, and yet China and ASEAN have several arrangements, whether it's of trade, environment, negotiation, etc. So, what does that say about China and the ASEAN?
Well, I think we have learned to handle the differences that we have. You know, I think in my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, I describe how I was the senior official leader from Singapore in the mid-1990s when we had our first ASEAN-China senior official consultations, I think in Guangzhou in China. And at that meeting, of course, the ASEAN countries, the 4 ASEAN countries that had differences with China on South China Sea, said, we must discuss the South China Sea. And China says, no, we cannot discuss the South China Sea. So it looked as though we had an impasse. But, you know, both China and ASEAN are flexible. So we agreed that in the official discussion during the daytime, we would not discuss South China Sea. Then we went for dinner. So after dinner, we decided to have coffee together after dinner. And at that coffee session after dinner, the ASEAN countries and China discussed South China Sea candidly.
Yeah.
You know? So technically, we didn't have a discussion of it in the conference room. Functionally, we did have a discussion of it over coffee, and all 10 ASEAN countries spoke out and explained to China that the South China Sea is an extremely important issue for ASEAN countries, and it is in China's interest to pay attention to this issue. And I must say the Chinese officials listened very carefully and were very sensitive to the feelings of the ASEAN countries.
So it helps when you have somebody in a genuinely negotiating and listening mode. And I recall several places you've talked of written about diplomats you interacted with who were not in a listening mode as opposed to those who were in a listening mode. Professor, where do we see, I mean, the very recent developments in Bangladesh, obviously it's an internal development, but what does it say in terms of obviously the power dynamics, the internal also has an impact on the external. But what happened in Bangladesh from your point of view?
Well, I mean, I was personally quite shocked by what happened in Bangladesh because I actually had visited Bangladesh about a year ago as a guest of a friend of mine in Bangladesh. And the country seemed to be thriving and growing. And it's actually quite amazing that, you know, when I was ambassador to the UN in the 1980s, Bangladesh's per capita GNP was among the lowest in South Asia, you know, and Bangladesh was actually a least developed country, right? And, you know, for example, his neighbor India was much higher than Bangladesh. But what's amazing is that as a result of getting a tremendous amount of foreign investment, especially in the textile sector, Bangladesh has been growing at 5 or 6% a year for decades. And as a result, its per capita income today, if I'm not mistaken, is higher than India, higher than Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken. And so it shows that in economic development, Bangladesh is doing the right thing. But when you have economic development, you must also have political development. And here it's a pity that Sheikh Hasina didn't try to have a more inclusive political structure. And if, for example, she alienated the Nobel Prize winner Muhammad Yunus, who, by the way, is a friend of mine. I met him many times. And, you know, it's better for leaders anywhere in the world to create inclusive political systems rather than political systems that are very bitterly divided. So I suspect a lot of countries are going to pay attention to what happened in Bangladesh and work harder for political succession. And here again, I must say, the ASEAN countries are providing a role model. In Singapore, we've had peaceful political succession, for 40 over years now, consistently. And even our large neighbor, Indonesia, as you know, is now, frankly, a role model as a democracy
Yes.
for the world. I was invited by President SBY, the previous president, to go and talk to the cabinet in Indonesia. I was invited by the current president, President Jokowi, to accompany him and to see what he has done for Indonesia. And I wrote an article called The Genius of Jokowi for Project Syndicate. And last week, for example, I was again in Indonesia, where I was invited by the incoming president of Indonesia, President Prabowo, to talk to some members of his incoming team. And so with this direct relationship that I've had with 3 Indonesian presidents, I can see that Indonesia has created a model for the world on how to arrange peaceful political succession. So you have a negative So you have a negative example from Bangladesh, but you also have a positive example from Indonesia and Singapore.
From Indonesia. And I guess no matter what, people will always stand up for their rights, whether they're living in occupied territories, whether it's Gaza, Palestine, or UN underscores what happens in Kashmir as well. We've seen so many reports coming out from UN rapporteurs in terms of what's happening in Indian occupied Kashmir. So without granting people's rights within a country or occupied land, I think, as you say, you can have economic development, but peace will not be sustained. Professor, this has been such a pleasure to have you on our show, and congratulations on this book. And I would ask our viewers to really pick up the book and read it, because it's very interesting reading, and it's basically gripping reading as well. Takes you through the century. Thank you so much again, Kishore, for joining us. नाज़रीन, इसी पर हम आज का प्रोग्राम ख़त्म करते हैं। खुदा हाफ़िज़। पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद।